So in our last video, we took a rather lighthearted and poetic look at Dr. Seuss, at books for children. This week, I'm afraid we're going to have to be a little bit more prosaic and serious as we turn to retirement and old age provision. So what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economics Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria, and this week we're going to be taking a look at a particular dimension of Social Security, namely old age provision. So one of the things I find interesting about old age in general is that it's a stage of life that increasingly the majority of people in the developed world can expect to reach. To look at the elderly, then, is to see yourself many years down the line. To see how we treat the elderly is then to see how we might be treated many years down the line. And one of the things I find interesting about the topic of old age provision is that it includes many aspects we commonly encounter when we discuss Social Security, such as unemployment or retirement, healthcare, that sort of thing. And this is an increasingly important issue in the Western world in this day and age because of the combination of an aging population that is living longer and a decrease in birth rates. Countries like Japan and Italy have the oldest populations in the world, and their birth rates are not looking very great either. 1/3 of Japan's citizens, for example, is already over 65 years old. Within the next decade, their workforce is going to decrease by some 8 million people, which will severely affect their economy and the state's ability to provide for its citizens. And it's not just Japan and Italy that face these problems. Similar problems confront countries such as South Korea, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Poland, and many others. Now, it's not uniformly all bad across the West. I mean, for example, some countries like the US and Canada will see some moderate growth in their working age population over the next 40 years, while other countries such as Australia and especially Israel will see significant growth in their working age population. However, this should not obscure the fact that when it comes to the working age population, the global trend, or at least the trend in the West, is downwards. We're looking at a 10% decrease by 2060. Not to throw too many numbers at you, but I just want to put this into a bit of perspective, that by 2050, so in less than 30 years from now, the number of people aged 60 and over will reach approximately 2 billion. 2 billion, think of that for a moment, because 2 billion was the total population of the entire planet back in 1927, less than a century ago. It seems that starting around 1960 or so, when the world population was about 3 billion people, that every 12 years or so, we add another billion. Presently, we're almost at 8 billion people. Now, that may or may not be a problem, but where it does become problematic is that if you look at 1970, there were 10 workers for every person aged 65 or older. By 2050, there will be only 4 workers for every person aged 65 and older. And in some countries in Europe, it will be even less than 2 workers. Already in the 1960s, Hayek saw the potential for intergenerational conflict, and this could become even more acute as the generation of dependents grows relative to the population that's paying into the system. Hayek's language on this matter is, frankly, almost apocalyptic. I quote, "It will probably not be long before it is argued that because the retired have more time to spend money, they must be given more than those still at work. And with the age distribution we are approaching, there is no reason why the majority over 40 should not soon attempt to make those of a lower age toil for them. It may be only at that point that the physically stronger will rebel and deprive the old of both their political rights and their legal claims to be maintained." Well, thankfully, we haven't yet seen any mass rebellion against the old. But Hayek's whole concern in that quote is the same concern he brings to Social Security in general, which is his fear that an institution whose purpose is to help those battered by circumstances to get back on their feet, which is something that he supports, all too quickly such an institution would become an institution whose main purpose is to redistribute income. And as he puts it, the problem arises in serious form as soon as government undertakes to secure not only a minimum, but an adequate provision for all the aged, regardless of the individual's need or the contributions made by him. There are two critical steps that are almost invariably taken once the state assumes the monopoly of providing this protection. First, the protection is granted not only to those who have, through their contributions, gained a claim to it, but to those who have not yet had time to do so. And second, when the pensions are due, they are not paid out of the yield of an additional capital accumulated for the purpose, and therefore out of additional income due to the efforts of the beneficiary, but are a transfer of part of the fruits of the work of those currently producing. And of course, all of Hayek's problems with Social Security in these years are exacerbated by the ever-looming possibility of inflation, which would eat through the money you're putting aside today for your retirement tomorrow. Because in some respects, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Retirement. The promise of busting your ass for several years and then getting to sit back and relax comfortably in the denouement of your days. It's worth reflecting on how recent and unique this expectation is. It's true that the first state-organized old age retirement pension dates back to 1889, introduced by Bismarck in Imperial Germany. But I'd say that the expectation that the majority of people will reach old age and be able to retire is a legacy of the post-World War II boom years, where we saw growth unlike anything we had ever known. We saw the birth of the teenager, a new stage in life. The teenager whose clothing, musical preferences, lifestyle were to be distinguished from those of his parents. No longer was a teenage boy or girl expected to grow up and go into the exact same profession as their parents. Similarly, at the upper end, we saw increasing life expectancy and the possibility of a phase in our life that comes after work. For most of human history, you toiled away until you dropped dead. You did so because you had to. You had to survive. You had to make a living somehow. The luxurious idea that you could toil away at something you were passionate about, that you could make a living off of your vocation, is something much more modern. So too the idea that you could live comfortably without working and enjoy retirement in old age. I mention all of this simply to raise the point that many of our expectations that we consider to be so self-evident in this day and age are actually of comparatively recent provenance. The very generation that was the first to taste of this new way of life was the baby boomers. They are the generation that bequeathed to us many advancements, great growth, and great expectations. And why the dickens shouldn't they? And now that they're old and retired, or in some cases they're going to be retiring soon, and they must be cared for by the young and employed, and the generation after them will have to be cared for by the comparatively diminishing number of young and employed, and so on and so forth. Or do they need to be cared for? In the case of some older people, of course, the answer is yes, but the type of care, who is to provide it, all of these things vary from person to person. To find out how to resolve the problem, or at least begin to tackle the problem of old age provision moving forward, we might want to take a closer look at some of the assumptions we make about old age. For example, at what point is someone considered old? Is it a question of their age, of their physical or mental faculties, of their usefulness to others? By some standards, we've taken age 65 to be the beginning of old age, of retirement, of the final phase of life. If you go back further and look at the biblical tradition, then you find the span of human life calculated as 70 years and 10. So in other words, 70 years. Throughout history, some various cultures have thought that a human's life was composed of different stages. For example, the stage of youth, from birth to roughly 25 years old. Then the stage of adulthood, from roughly 25 to 45. Then the stage of maturity, from roughly 45 to 70, followed finally by old age. Now, these divisions were of some importance because you could say that different qualities or duties were associated with each stage. By one reckoning, you could say that the qualities of youth are obedience, modesty, and beauty. Of adulthood, self-control, courage, love, courtesy, respect for the law. Of maturity, prudence, justice, generosity, and charm. And of old age, wisdom and a readiness to face death. Now, if you adhere to this sort of thinking, then you would say that different stages of life suggest different forms of behavior. That it's indecent or improper for an adult to act like a child, or for an old person to act full of vim and vigor. And to some extent, this will always be true since we reasonably expect a greater capacity for judgment and common sense from an adult than we do from a child. Needless to say, sometimes our expectations are disappointed. And similarly, we cannot deny that our faculties, particularly our physical faculties, diminish as we embark upon our senior years. But I do wonder if we have excessively assimilated the idea that the elderly are generally incapable, and that we are therefore doing both them and ourselves, the younger generations, a great disservice. A disservice to ourselves because the elderly might still be able to contribute a great deal to society, and therefore we would be less inclined to see them as a burden. But I also think that seeing the elderly as incapable is a disservice to them, because that sort of infantilizing attitude adds to the degradation of their faculties. Anecdotally, I mentioned that I've met several older people who are retired. They have nothing to do. They feel and they know that they are dependent on others and that they're really not needed by anybody else. They appear to me to degenerate quickly. Then there are those who are still employed part-time, or they are involved in their community, or they have their various projects. They have something to exercise their minds. They are still in control of something. They are needed by others. Indeed, others depend on them still. And they do not degenerate so quickly. They still seem young. So one way, and this admittedly is a very small and partial contribution, but one way of beginning to deal with some of the problems of an aging population and the effects this will have on our public finances is to change the way that we view old age. Many old people are still capable of contributing. Many would feel a greater sense of self-worth if they did contribute, if people depended on them. And I don't mean just giving them some random tasks to keep them busy, but useful things that actually need to get done. One option is volunteer work, which is very valuable indeed. About a quarter of US residents volunteer, which makes up about 7.9 billion hours of service, or about $184 billion. Another thing that's already being discussed is, given that people are living longer, you raise the retirement age and limit access to the benefits prior to retirement. Or you could phase in retirement by lowering working hours for the elderly, but keeping them in the workforce, and so they continue to pay taxes. Older people can be very valuable to organizations, moreover, because of their experience and the institutional knowledge that they've built up over the years. They can be great mentors for younger employees. Of course, the possibility of an older person continuing to work is all dependent on the sector, and I'm aware that it may be the case with these proposals that all they effectively do is push the horizon of old age a little bit higher. In all likelihood, there will still be a difference in terms of the capabilities and contributions of a 65-year-old versus an 85-year-old. Let's pause for a moment on the idea, though, of older people being wise and useful for the experience they can convey to younger people. The elderly provide us with a link to the past. They impart values and wisdom. So another idea that has been posited by some social scientists is called intergenerational learning. And as always, let's not forget that Hayek would always say that the private sector can play a role here, or that even if some of these proposals were government financed, they needn't necessarily be government run. So if you take, for example, countries like Canada, the US, Sweden, Australia, some others, they've already initiated projects involving some form of intergenerational learning, and in many cases spearheaded by universities. This intergenerational learning provides reciprocal benefits. I imagine many of us can think of parents or grandparents who learned how to use a piece of technology or an app thanks to their children or grandchildren. But of course, it also works the other way around. Even in our proverbially fast-paced, ever-changing world, some things stay the same, such as human nature, the need to deal with others, the fact that we will face adversity during our lives. The elderly have dealt with these dimensions of human existence, of the human experience, even if in some other variation, the underlying theme was still the same. They can counsel youth through tough times then, because they've been there. They can provide compassion and wisdom, which the youth may or may not be getting at home. They can provide some guidance, which is something that many of us need. So we started this video looking at a problem that is rather unique to our time. The problem of greater life expectancy, an aging population, and lower rates of fertility, coupled with social systems under extreme pressure. And all this partially due to the view we have of old age. We started with this unique and very 20th and 21st century problem. But then we saw that it was rooted in a problem that has existed since the beginning of human community. A problem that, if we're all fortunate, we will all need to confront: the problem of getting old. We find attempts to deal with this issue philosophically going all the way back to the ancients. For example, the Roman orator Marcus Tullius Cicero wrote a treatise on old age. By the way, this is a painting of Cicero done by my mother-in-law, who is setting an example by keeping busy in her old age. In Cicero's mind, old age could be rather enjoyable, provided you had the right attitude. As he says, men who lack within themselves the means to live a virtuous and happy life find every stage of life a burden. But men who wish to derive everything good from themselves cannot regard as evil whatever is inevitably imposed by nature's laws. The most suitable weapons for defending old age are the qualities and practice of virtues. If these are cultivated in every stage of life, they yield wonderful fruits. Once a man has lived a lengthy and full life, this is not only because one never loses virtues, not even at the very end of life, although that is no small matter, but also because a man's awareness of a life well spent and his recollection of many actions well performed are a source of the greatest happiness. So what about Hayek? Well, as for Hayek, He dealt with old age by continuing to do what he did best, thinking and writing, up until the last few years of his life when he was more frequently ill. But even before that point, even in his 80s, he was giving talks, interviews, and working on his final book called The Fatal Conceit: The Errors of Socialism. His children remembered that his life was his work, but in his old age, he did grow closer to them and his grandchildren, to whom he used to read stories. Not everything was perfect, of course. He had gone deaf in one ear, but he had made light of it. He said, "It has its advantages," he quipped, pointing at his hearing aid. "I can now turn people on and off." He lived until 1992, a month and a half shy of his 93rd birthday. A long and productive life. And he wasn't the only one. To return to Cicero, who reports millennia ago, the pre-Socratic philosopher Gorgias of Leontini reached a total of 107 years without ever ceasing in his enthusiasm for his work. When the question was put to him why he wished to remain alive for so long, he said, "I have no reason to find fault with old age." Not a bad outlook at all. And that's what Hayek would say.
This guy is awesome. He's got a lot of great stuff to say. I hope you've really been enjoying our videos. If you have, and if you'd like to hear what Hayek has to say about something else, anything, then let me know in the comments. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends.